Today's going to be the start of a series I'm going to be doing, looking at the book of Zechariah. It came from a question that I got last year, and it seems like it's taken a little too long for me to get around to it. But I'm here now, and we're going to delve into this and start looking at the book of Zechariah. One thing I found with studying the book of Zechariah is when I first read through it, it just seemed rather confusing. It seemed disjointed, like the prophecies were jumping all over the place. But the more I've spent time in it and the more I've looked into it, the more harmonious the book is, the more it works together, and the more you see this single picture being built up of what God is wanting to show his people. Now, just a sort of an overview of the book of Zechariah and how it's set out there. It's got a short introduction at the beginning. The first 6 verses talk about this message that God has for his people. He speaks about the fathers before the exile and how they got taken away to Babylon, and how he doesn't want that again for his people. He wants his people to come close to him, to walk in faithfulness. And that is a message that continually occurs throughout the visions and the prophecies of this book. And following on from that, in this first large section, from verse 7 of chapter 1 through to the end of chapter 6, there are these 8 visions that Zechariah sees. And after these 8 visions, there's this final image, this final prophecy or prophetic vision of Christ sitting as a priest upon his throne, and the council of peace being between the Father and Son. And one thing we notice about these visions, and we'll dig into it in more detail and flesh it out when we get to that. But you see that each of them are paired up. That the first one deals with these horsemen of these different colors, these 4 horsemen. And the last of these 8 deals with these 4 chariots of these same colors. And these are parallel visions, speaking of the same message, just shedding more light on each other. The same thing with the 4 horns and 4 carpenters and the woman of Ephraim. These both deal with the Israel being carried away into captivity. Then the Jerusalem is measured in this flying scroll, of both visions that talk about God's people being judged. Then these middle 2 visions, we have one about Joshua the high priest and one about Zerubbabel, the heir to the throne of David, and what God is trying to show us through them. And then that culminates with this final extra one about Christ as the priest upon his throne. And after that, the last half of the book is dedicated to these 3 prophecies. First, the word of the Lord to his people and the priests. Then it's the word of the Lord to the nations, and finally the word of the Lord to Israel. And it's in these prophecies that Zechariah presents certain things that raise a lot of questions. We see an image of Christ descending as feet upon the Mount of Olives, that splits in 2. And that is presented right after Jerusalem is attacked and delivered. And so the big question is, what is happening in these prophecies? Also to the nations, it's God is destroying the nations in one verse, and then the nations are being saved by God in the next. It seems like he's jumping all over the place here. But as we go through this, we're going to see some harmony build and some principles of how to interpret and understand all of this. But this is the layout that the book of Zechariah gives us. But before we can start on these meaty parts of the visions and the prophecies, I first want to look at the introduction. What is the first thing that God is wanting us to know when we come to the book? What is in this message? But to actually get the context of this message, we need to look a bit more about the context in which Zechariah was written. Zechariah was a post-exilic prophet. So he was after that Israel had returned from Babylon, and they were back to the promised land. And so we're actually going to start with that story to find out what have God's people been doing leading up to the prophecies given in the book of Zechariah. Because these prophecies are speaking to God's people at a certain point with a message that they need for where they are. And when we understand that message given for where they are, then we can make that applicable to what does that mean for us where we are. And so we're actually going to start in the book of Ezra. Ezra chapter 1, with the decree of Cyrus. read here in Ezra 1 verse 1. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it also in writing, saying, who is there among you of all his people? His God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel, which is in Jerusalem. But he is God. And so here, Cyrus gives the proclamation, the decree, that anyone who wants to, or anyone of Judah who wants to go back to Jerusalem to build the house of the Lord, they can. And he sends them back with this commission. And as we pick up in the next chapter, it gives us a list of a whole bunch of the people and the families that take up this call. We read, now these are the children of the province that went up out of the captivity of those which had been carried away, from whom Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon had carried away into Babylon, and came again into Jerusalem and Judah, everyone into his city, which came up with Zerubbabel. Now, Zerubbabel here is the one who actually took the group back to Israel, to Jerusalem. He was the grandson of the person who was king when Nebuchadnezzar came and took them captives. He is the heir to the throne of David, and he was appointed as governor of Jerusalem and Judah. And it carries on naming a number of other people that went with him, but I've just included the first one here, which is here in Ezra, it's spelled Jeshua. It's Jeshua, the son of Jozadak, who is the high priest. Throughout Hosea and Zechariah, it's Joshua. For some reason here it's spelled it with an E instead of an O, but it's referring to that same person. So you have Zerubbabel, the heir to the throne of David, and Joshua the high priest were the first two here listed that are taking the people back to Jerusalem. And throughout the rest of the chapter, it carries on to name the families of the people and the numbers that went back. It had a couple of thousand people there returning in this first migration back to the promised land, back to their home in order to build the temple. And at the end of that chapter we read, and some of the chief of the fathers, when they came to the house of the Lord, which is at Jerusalem, offered freely of the house of God to set up in his place. They gave after their abilities unto the treasure of the work 61,000 drams of gold, and 5,000 pounds of silver, and 100 priest garments. And so this is something that stands out. As soon as they are brought back into the promised land, we see that the people that were brought back from captivity, initially they start giving this abundance of offerings of gold, of silver, of garments for the priest, for the work of God. It's similar to what we first read when the people were brought out of Egypt, and how when the offering came to build the sanctuary, they just gave in abundance. We see this similar spirit being manifested here with these people returning from exile. That there is this the spirit of renewal, of a desire for revival among them, to reestablish what God had wanted, to walk in his ways. And we carry on. Then stood up Jeshua, the son of Jozadak, and his brethren, the priests, and Zerubbabel, the son of Salathiel, and his brethren, and builded the altar of the God of Israel, who offered burnt offerings thereon, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. And so we see not only all these offerings are coming back, but here one of the first things they do is they build an altar so they can start offering sacrifices and burnt offerings to God. And it carries on speaking that they then kept the Feast of Tabernacles. They started keeping the law. They started devoting themselves to following in the ways that God wanted them to. And they also started building the temple. And we read there in verse 10. And when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, they set the priests in their apparel with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, to praise the Lord, after the ordinance of David, king of Israel. And so we see this, like I said, everything at the beginning of the story is building. God's people being faithful. They've returned. They're freely giving. They're following the law of Moses. They're celebrating after the ordinance of David. But they're continually moving forward and wanting to serve and follow God. But at this point, we find there's some mixed feelings when this foundation is laid. We read, but many of the priests and Levites and chief of the fathers who were ancient men that had seen the first house when the foundations of this house was laid before their eyes wept with a loud voice, and many shouted aloud for joy. And so there's these mixed emotions happening here. The younger men that had not seen Solomon's temple, when the foundations are laid, they're shouting, they're celebrating at what God is doing. But the older men that were there and saw Solomon's temple are weeping because of how much this is falling short of the glory of what they had. They're weeping because of how much it pales in comparison, because of what they had lost. And it just seemed so little. So there's these mixed emotions. There's this weeping over what was lost, but rejoicing over what God was doing now. And it's an interesting situation going on here. But still, we get this idea that even amongst all of this, God's people are still moving forward. There's still this desire to follow God, to consecrate him, to serve him, to work for him, to establish his will. But then in chapter 4, we see things starting to change. Now, when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the children of the captivity builded the temple unto the Lord God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and to the chief of the fathers and said unto them, let us build with you, for we seek your God, as ye do, and we do sacrifice unto him since the days of Eshcol, king of Ashur, which brought us up hither. Now, so here they're building the temple, they're following God, and they get their neighbors coming along saying, we want to help you. We worship the same God as you do. We've been sacrificing to him since the days of Esarhaddon, the king of Ashur. Now, this king of Ashur is the king of Assyria. If you're familiar with the story in 2 Kings 17, the king of Assyria, Shalmaneser, went and invaded the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, and took all the people captives and carried them away and dispersed them throughout the kingdom of Assyria. And he took other people from throughout the kingdom and brought them back to settle in Samaria. And while they were living in Samaria, they were worshipping the gods from whatever nations they were brought from. And there were some issues that arose. Many people started being killed by lions and various other beasts living in the land. And so they sent away to the king of Assyria saying, we don't know how to worship the God of this land. He keeps sending beasts to devour us. And so the king sent back some Levites to teach them about the law of Moses and how to worship the God of Israel. And so then all the Samaritans started worshiping the God of Israel according to as the Levites taught, just enough so they would stop being eaten by lions. But then they kept worshiping all the gods from the nations of which they had come as well. And so the Samaritan religion started developing as this merger of Moses and all these other pagan religions. And so when they're coming here saying, we're worshiping the same God as you, but for the Samaritans, that they thought they were. They thought, yeah, we are worshiping the same God. Let us build this temple with you. Let us come worship at this temple. But Zerubbabel wasn't full of that. He wasn't having any of that. He knew that they weren't worshiping the same God. He knew that the God they were worshiping was some mix of the God of the Bible mixed in with all these pagan ideas and religion. It was a corrupted religion. And so it says that him and Joshua and all the other elders, that they weren't having that. They weren't going to allow these half sort of half Jewish, half pagan religions to come in and defile the temple of God and bring them right back to the very things that sent them into captivity. And so we read, but Zerubbabel and Jeshua and the rest of the chiefs of the fathers of Israel said unto them, Ye have nothing to do with us to build a house unto our God, but we ourselves together will build unto the Lord God of Israel, as King Cyrus of Persia hath commanded us. And so they said no. And the Samaritans got offended at this, and they started trying to cause trouble from them. And this is sort of the beginning of the feud between the Jews and the Samaritans that lasted right up until the time of Christ. We see that feud still being there with the woman at the well, when she asked, we worship God in this land, and you say that in Jerusalem. There was this divide between them. They both claimed to follow Moses. Just one was following according to the scriptures, and the other was following according to the scriptures, plus all these other traditions and pagan practices that were brought into that. So as it was carried on here, once these Samaritans were told no, they continued to make trouble. They continued to make trouble for Israel. They wrote to the king of Medo-Persia and informed them that the Jews were building the temple, and the Jews were a rebellious nation, that they continued to rebel, that they had mighty kings that controlled them, and if they let them do this, they will rebel against you. And so the king wrote to them and said they had to stop. And so we read that then ceased the work of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem. So it ceased unto the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. And so there's this change that happens. Initially, when Israel comes out of Babylon, God brings his people up, and that they are serving him in faithfulness. They're freely giving of all their wealth, their gold and their silver for the building of the temple. They're laying the foundations. They're instituting all the laws of Moses. They're worshiping according to the ordinance of David. And when these other Samaritans come with their corrupted pagan practices, they're like, no, we are not allowing that in our temple. And they seem to be moving forward and following God faithfully all the way. But then things get hard. Their neighbors do whatever they can to try to hinder them. The government, the king of Persia, tells them they need to stop, and they can't do it. And so God's people just stop. They stop obeying God. They stop following him. They stop seeking after his way because it just got too hard. There were too many roadblocks. The neighbors that lived up in Samaria were making it too hard for them. The king was making it too hard for them, telling them they couldn't do it. And so they just stopped until the 2nd year in the reign of Darius. Now, something happened in the 2nd year of the reign of Darius. We'll read about that in the beginning of chapter 5. Then the prophets, Haggai, the prophet, and Zechariah, the son of Iddo, prophesied unto the Jews that were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the Lord God of Israel, even unto them. And then rose up Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, the son of Josedek, and began to build the house of God, which is at Jerusalem. And with them were the prophets of God helping them. So the people just stopped building the temple. They just stopped doing that until the 2nd year of Darius. And in the 2nd year of Darius, something happened. 2 prophets. One is Zechariah, and the other is Haggai. They stood up and they started prophesying. These 2 prophets stood up at the same time, bringing a message to the people in Jerusalem. And just for reference, we've got Darius here. That's mentioned here as Darius the Great. His reign began in 522 BC. And so the 2nd year of his reign, when Haggai and Zechariah stood up and began to deliver the word of the Lord to his people, was around 520 BC. Now, throughout the books of Haggai and Zechariah, they actually date every one of the prophecies, the word of the Lord that they deliver. Haggai's all fall within that 1 year. The first part of Zechariah's falls within that 1 year, but the last prophecies to his people, the nation in Israel, happens a couple of years later in the 4th year of Darius. And so when we put all those prophecies there, whereas apart from this last part, Zechariah 7 to 14, that last half of that book, which is in the 4th year of Darius, every one of the other prophecies in Zechariah and Haggai happened in the 2nd year of Darius. And I want to notice as well what months they're delivered, because it dates it all. The first prophecy in Haggai comes in the 6th month. The second one in Haggai chapter 2 comes in the 7th month. Then that opening of Zechariah is given in the 8th month. And then the final part of Haggai is given in the 9th month. And then there's a gap, nothing in the 10th month, and then in the 11th month, the visions of Zechariah again. But today we're really going to focus on these first 4. Over 4 months, God delivers 4 prophecies, one per month for this time. And I think that's significant, especially when we see that some of these prophecies overlap. You know, that the first one in Zechariah happens in between the last 2 in Haggai. So while you can just look at that introduction to Zechariah, that message to the fathers, and what God's calling his people to do within the context of Zechariah and how that builds throughout the story, it's far more powerful to see what was the message that God was delivering to his people who had come out of Babylon, the decree of Cyrus around 538, started building the temple, started being faithful, following Moses, following the ordinance of David. And then when things got hard, they stopped. And we're not given an exact date of that, but roughly between 15 and 20 years, give or take, they had stopped following God. They had stopped building the temple until the 2nd year of Darius, when these 4 messages were delivered, one each month. And now we're going to look at these messages and see what is this message that God wanted to deliver to his people. And how does this help us understand the opening of Zechariah to set the direction for the rest of the book. Now, first off, in Haggai, it starts off, in the 2nd year of Darius the king, in the 6th month, in the 1st day of the month, came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet unto Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, saying, Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, This people say, the time is not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built. That was the first thing he had to address. The people were saying, it's not time to build the Lord's house. But why had they said that? What was bringing them to reach that conclusion? Because when they first came up out of Babylon, they started building it straight away. They started gathering offerings, the priest garments, offering burnt offerings upon the altar and laying the foundation. It was the first things they moved towards. But then things got hard. The people around them started interfering. The king, the government started telling them they couldn't do it. And because it got hard, they said, God must want us to not do it. It mustn't be time. If it was time to do it, God would make it easy. But that's not what God is telling them. It was time for them to do it. God wanted them to return. It was time for them as soon as Cyrus sent them back. But they had spending the last 15 plus years ignoring God's work and doing their own. And so he carries on. Is it time for you, O ye, to dwell in your sealed houses, and this house lieth waste? Now therefore, thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Ye have sown much and bring in little. Ye eat, but ye have not enough. Ye drink, but ye are not filled with drink. Ye clothe you, but there is none warm. And he that earneth wages to put it into a bag with hole. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. And so God is calling them to reflect on their life. There's this last 15 plus years that they had been ignoring God, that they had been putting God not even as a last priority, but saying that God doesn't even want us to put him as a priority. God doesn't even want us to build his house. It's not time for that yet. Believing that God isn't even on the list of priorities, and they've been putting themselves and what they want first. He says, this is what you have been doing, and consider what the result has been. Everything that you're trying to do is falling apart. You've been, earning money to put it into a bag with holes. Everything's been getting lost and coming to nothing. Now consider your ways, reflect on what you have been doing and what's the result. And then after he calls them to this reflection on their priorities, on where they have put God in their life and what the result has been, he calls them to change. Go up to the mountain and bring wood and build the house, and I will take pleasure in it, and I will be glorified, saith the Lord. He calls them to obedience, to start doing the work that God has called you to do. You carry on reading. Then Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Joshua the son of Josedek, the high priest, with all the remnant of the people, obeyed the voice of the Lord their God and the words of Haggai the prophet, as the Lord their God had said them. And the people did fear before the Lord. So after hearing this, after being called for self-reflection, they did. They reflected on what they had done, that they realized how they had fallen away, and they changed, they repented, and they began to obey the voice of God and did what he called them to do. And now I find that the next verse really interesting. It says, then spake Haggai, the Lord's messenger, and the Lord's message to the people, saying, I am with you, saith the Lord. And the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, the governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, the son of Josedek, the high priest, and the spirit of all the remnant of the people. And they came and did work in the house of the Lord of hosts, their God. Now, that's something I find really interesting, that the people had already made the decision, they had already turned to obey God, to start doing this, to start gathering wood, to start building the house. But then God comes in verse 14 and says that he stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the people to come and work on the house of the Lord. And it seems strange. Why does God need to stir up their spirits to work on the house of the Lord once they've already started obeying to work on the house of the Lord? And that really highlights to me the futility of trusting in will, in humanity's ability to obey. I don't really do New Year's resolutions anymore. I was never really that big in it, but I don't remember making a New Year's resolution that lasted until February. It starts out the beginning, New Year's Day, you'd make it, and normally the first week it would go really well. The second week kind of well. The third week a bit iffy. The fourth week not so well. And by the time it gets to February, it's gone. And that is all too often, I find in human experience. When something first happens, it's very easy to get motivated to get up and to do it. But to carry through on that, especially when it comes to serving God, you need something else. Okay, the people heard this message. They took this time to self-reflect, and they chose to get up and follow God. But if that was all it was, then their efforts and their dedication to follow God and to obey him would have fallen flat in no time. It would be no different than Peter telling Christ, I will never deny you. And Jesus says, well, before the cock crows, you'll deny me 3 times. Before the rooster crows in the morning, you're going to deny me 3 times this night. It doesn't matter how much dedication and absolute determination he had when he made that statement. That was all it was, human determination, human effort, and that would not stand in the face of spiritual warfare. So when these people are here and they've done this self-reflection, they've considered their ways, and they turn to follow God and to obey him, if that is all it was, their efforts would fall flat. But God comes along, and with their efforts to obey, he stirs up their spirit and makes it possible for them to carry through on their dedication, to carry through on their devotion. And this is that idea that Our obedience is only possible because God is there with us. He will never force our obedience. He will never take away our free will and force us to obey. We need to make that decision. We need to surrender to God, to follow his ways, to commit to obeying him and walking after what he has said. But if all it is our commitment, we will never achieve it. We need God to be there, as it says here, to stir up our spirits, to allow us to follow through on that commitment, to trust that he will work in us, both to will and to do with his good pleasure. So that is the message that is being delivered here in Haggai. And so this first message of consider your ways is a message of changing. It's a call to obedience. The first message that God gives them in Haggai is calling the people to reflect on their ways, on what the results of living after their own desires and their own ways have been, and to repent and call them back to obedience. And after this call to obedience, in the next month, God sends them another message by the prophet Haggai. In the 7th month, in the 21st day of the month, came the word of the Lord by the prophet Haggai, saying, "Speak now to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Josedek, the high priest, and to the residue of the people, saying, Who is left among you that saw this house in her former glory? And now do ye see it? And how do you see it now? Is it not in your eyes in comparison of it as nothing?" You know, we saw before in Ezra, when they first laid the foundation of the house, that the people who saw Solomon's temple were weeping at how pitiful, how much this fell short of the glory that they had before. And, you know, the people are working on this. And he's talking to the people that are building this, saying, you know, you who remember that, does this seem as nothing? All your efforts, all your obedience, all your work that's going into building this, and it seems like it's coming to nothing, like it powers in comparison, you know. And it's very hard, you know, even with good intentions and good motivations, to carry on doing something when it seems like it's not achieving anything. It's very easy to get demotivated when you work on a project, mate. You could be working on it for a year or 2 years, and then just to see it come to nothing right before you. It's very hard in those times to carry on, to believe that you're actually doing something worthwhile. And God knows this is how his people are feeling. And so he's coming to them and addressing it. He's saying, look, I know how you're feeling. Okay, I know that you remember Solomon's temple, and why you're giving of yourself to build this one, to serve me in obedience in building this second temple. But it seems like nothing. I know how this can be disheartening. And then he begins to speak to them and encourage them. I want to notice how he does that. What is the encouragement he gives to his people when they're being disillusioned by the works of their hands achieving nothing? He says, "Yet now, be strong, O Zerubbabel, saith the Lord. Be strong, O Joshua, son of Josedek, the high priest, and be strong, all ye people of the land, saith the Lord, and work, for I am with you, saith the Lord of hosts. According to the word that I covenanted with you when ye came out of Egypt, so my spirit remaineth among you. Fear ye not." So the first thing he does is he encourages them to be strong and take courage because God is with them. And essentially, he doesn't just say because he's with them, but he points out, according to the covenant that I made with you when I brought you out of Egypt. Okay, when the covenant that God made with his people when they were slaves wandering through a desert. Okay, and what was that promise? That they would be a jewel among the nations. That they would be a great nation, that all the nations would come to them and say, what nation is this so wise? You know, those slaves in the wilderness could not see what God would turn them into. That they could not perceive of a kingdom as great as Solomon's, from whom, you know, the Queen of Sheba and people from all around the place came to hear his wisdom. And the kingdom that was so great that silver was counted as nothing. that silver was worthless in the capital because there was so much wealth there. That people couldn't realize with what they had when they were walking through the wilderness as, slaves saved from Egypt. They kept saying, oh, we should go back, because at least back in Egypt, we had leeks and onions and these other things to eat. They couldn't see what the kingdom that God was leading them to and the riches that were in store for them. And so in the same way, he's saying, look at what I took your fathers from and what I'm taking them to. Now, what you're doing now, it seems like it's nothing in your eyes. It seems like it's achieving nothing. You want to just walk away from it and just go back to building your houses and just go back to how you were before you started this work. But I'm going to do something with this. I'm going to take where you are now and turn it into something great. And he carries on in this prophecy. For thus saith the Lord of hosts, yet once it is a little while, and I will shake the heavens and the earth and the sea and the dry land, and I will shake all nations, and the desire of all nations shall come and will fill this house with glory, saith the Lord of hosts. The silver is mine, and the gold is mine, saith the Lord of hosts. The glory of this latter house shall be greater than the former, saith the Lord of hosts. And in this place will I give peace, saith the Lord of hosts. So they're building this temple. It seems like nothing in their eyes, but he says, no, this will be greater than the former temple. The former temple, it had all the gold, it had all the silver, it had all the splendor, it was big and magnificent. But this later temple will have the glory of the Son of God walking through its courts, preaching the gospel to the poor in its courts. The glory of this latter house shall be far greater than the former. So don't look at what your hands are building. Don't look at what the works of your hands is achieving. Look at what the promise of God will bring there. If we just look at what we can do and what we have done, it's very easy to get disillusioned. It's very easy to be discouraged. But God's calling people. Don't look at just the works of your hands and compare it to what's gone before or what others have done. Look at what, from heaven's point of view, what I am going to do through this. It's not your works that bring glory to this place, but it's the promise of God. And so God is calling them to not trust into their works, but trust into his promise. Even if from all human eyes, it seems like what we're doing is achieving nothing. I very strongly believe that there is no work we do for God that is ever wasted. Even if it seems like it just disappears in front of us and it's taken away and nothing has ever come of that. God has a plan. And although we never see it, because no one ever building this temple got to see the glory that would fill it. It was over 500 years before Christ would come. All they got to see is what their hands had built, which did not compare to what others had done, did not compare to Solomon. They never got to see that glory. But nonetheless, that glory came there and it filled that temple. And I believe exactly the same thing happens with us. Whenever God asks us to do a work, it's never wasted. Though we might not see any fruit from it, though it might look like it comes to nothing. God has a plan in everything. And so at first, the message for God's people was a call to obedience. And then the next message is a call to look to the promise. And I think two significant things come from this. First, they needed to realize that despite all their obedience, it was not their obedience that could achieve anything great. It was only the promise. Lest they be in the danger of thinking that their works had achieved something great. No. God calls them to obedience, but it's not our obedience that brings greatness or glory. It's looking to God's promise. And now with these two messages for the people, this call to obedience, this looking to the promise, then we move to the prophecy given to his people by the word of the Lord in the 8th month. The following month, Zechariah came and begins to speak to the people. We read, In the 8th month, in the 2nd year of Darius, came the word of the Lord unto Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo, the prophet, saying, The Lord hath been sore displeased with your fathers. Therefore say thou unto them, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, Turn ye unto me, saith the Lord of hosts, and I will turn unto you, saith the Lord of hosts. Now, initially reading this in that context, it seemed strange because initially God's people were called to obedience in the 6th month, and they followed that and they began obeying. They were called to look to the promise in the 7th month. And it seemed by all accounts that they were encouraged by that. But now God's saying, he gives this message, I've been displeased with your fathers, therefore draw nigh to me, turn to me, and I will turn to you. There's something else that's needed. There's another step along this journey that God wants to bring them to. He wants them to draw close to him so he can draw close to them. Turn to me and I will turn to you. He wants this connection with his people, this establishment of relationship. We've had the obedience, we've had the promise. Now we need that relationship, because it's very hard to trust a promise that comes from someone that you don't have any connection with. But when there's a relationship established, that promise becomes meaningful, which gives the obedience purpose. And that is what God is trying to establish here in this third word of the Lord that has been delivered to his people. The need to establish relationship. And in this message, he says, that he was displeased with the fathers, and he carries on talking about the example of the fathers. He says, Be ye not as your fathers, unto whom the former prophets have cried, saying, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, Turn ye now from your evil ways, and from your evil doings. But they did not hear, nor hearken unto me, saith the Lord. Your fathers, where are they? And the prophets, do they live forever? But my words and my statutes, which I commanded my servants, the prophets, did they not take hold of your fathers? And they returned and said, Like as the Lord of hosts thought to do unto us, according to our ways and according to our doings, so has he dealt with us. Now, how does this story of the fathers fit into this full relationship? Because he's saying, look at what happened to the fathers. I spoke unto them, called them to turn from their evil ways, to turn to me, but they didn't. And then my word took hold of them. They were taken away into captivity, and they returned saying, just like God said, everything has happened to us according to our own doings. So has he dealt with us. And this is sort of reminiscent of Haggai's first message, consider your ways. Except instead of an individual level, it asks him to look at the big picture of the history of Israel, to consider Israel's ways, to consider the fathers, how they approached things, what they did, and what the consequences were. Because with the fathers there, it's not just this one time where they sinned and they were taken away to Babylon, but that was the last part of a long history of God's people oscillating from obedience to rebellion to obedience to rebellion, that they would go back for a little bit when they got a good king, and then they would fall into rebellion and sin, and then there'd be a revival and they'll go back to obedience and fall into rebellion. That there would be this constant cycle. And part of that cycle is that's just what they were doing. They were oscillating from obedience to rebellion. They never really developed a reason or to stay in that obedience, because they never developed that relationship, that connection with God. God was always just someone to be obeyed, or someone to rebel against, or just choose to obey a different God. There was no significance in the people of why should we obey this God over that God. They saw the gods of the nations around them, and they're like, well, that nation's prospering, maybe we should worship their God. Well, now that nation, maybe you should worship their God. And then they'd come back and worship the God of Israel. Once things would go good for a little bit and then change again. It was just oscillating from obedience to rebellion, because there was no connection between them and their God. There was no development of relationship. And so he's calling them to consider what happened with your fathers. Okay, I kept calling on them to draw close to me, to turn from the evil, but they didn't. And so they brought back this testimony that according to our ways and according to our doing, so has he dealt with us. And so Zechariah is delivering this message: turn to me and I will turn to you. Develop this relationship. And so this third message in the third month is about establishing relationship. And like we mentioned, without relationship, it's hard to trust in a promise with someone you don't have a connection. And the promise is what gives obedience its purpose. Knowing that even though we can't see the works of our hands, that God's promise that it will be prosperous, that there will be a greater glory coming out of it, that we will never get to see. Sometimes we're blessed and we do get to see the labors of the fruits of our labor, but not always, and not in the case of these people here building the temple. So we've had these three messages in 3 months: call to obedience, a call to look to the promise, to establish relationship. And now we get this fourth message in the fourth month here in a row, in Haggai 2. In the 4th and 20th day of the 9th month, in the 2nd year of Darius, came the word of the Lord to Haggai the prophet, saying, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, ask now the priests concerning the law, saying, if one be a holy flesh in the skirt of his garment, and with his skirt doth touch bread, or pottage, or wine, oil, or any meat, shall it be holy? And the priest answered and said, No. Then said Haggai, if one that is clean by a dead body touch any of these, shall it be clean? Shall it be unclean? And the priest answered and said, it shall be unclean. So he's asking them a question about the law. If you've got these things, bread, wine, meat, any of these things that are just normal, common things, if they come in contact with something holy, does it transfer holiness to them simply by proximity? The answer is no. But if it comes in contact with something unclean, does it transfer uncleanness to them? Yes. Okay, and so he's asking from the law, he's establishing this, and then he has something to say to them. Then answered Haggai and said, so is this people, and so is this nation before me, saith the Lord. And so is every work of their hands, and that which they offer there is unclean. This is a message for God's people. They're coming, they're working in the house of God, they're working in these holy things, but then they're going and they're doing things that are unclean in the rest of their life. And then they think they can come back and do work on which is holy and they'll be made holy. But that is not the way it works. Holiness is not just transferable by proximity. But when they go away and they do stuff that is unclean, okay, and they bring that to the work of God, they're bringing that uncleanness. And now when they're working on the stones, when they're offering the meat, when they're baking the bread, all that stuff is polluted by their uncleanness. It is not made holy by its connection with the temple. You cannot just absorb holiness by osmosis, by proximity. You need to be holy yourself. You need to be separated from these unclean things. And so here Haggai gives this message of a call to holiness, to separate from our lives the things that are unclean so that we can be holy and consecrated unto God. And following on from this message, he speaks to the people. And now I pray you, consider from this day forward, from before a stone was laid upon a stone in the temple of the Lord. Now he's calling them again. Haggai started off by saying, consider your ways. And now he's calling them again to consider, but to consider something different. Consider what God is going to do. Consider what is going to happen from this day forward, from the day you turn and started serving God forward. The day you made a choice from holiness forward. Since those days where one came to an heap of 20 measures, there were but 10. When one came to the press vat to draw out 50 vessels out of the press, there were but 20. I smote you with blastings and with mildew and with hail in all the labors of your hands. Yet ye turn not to me, saith the Lord. Consider now from this day forward, from the 4th and 20th day of the 9th month, even from the day that the foundations of the Lord's temple was laid, consider it. And so again, he's saying, consider what is happening from this day forward. Before now, like it said in the beginning of the chapter, you earned money to put it into bags with holes. Everything you did came to nothing. Now consider, now that we've been through this, this call to obedience, this looking to the promise, this establishment of relationship, and now this call to personal holiness. From this day forth, from the 24th day of the 9th month, from this day forward, consider what's going to happen. He says, is the seed yet in the barn? Yea. As yet the vine and the fig tree and the pomegranate and the olive tree have not brought forth, from this day I will bless you. And so here we have this call to obedience, looking to the promise, establishment of relationship. And this fourth message in the 4th month in a row is a call to being holy, a call for personal holiness. And he says, once we've been through this thing, from this day, consider how things are going to change. I will bless you. Consider what it was like the last 15 plus years when the temple of the Lord was lying desolate, when you were not doing the Lord's work because it was too hard because of the people that lived around you. And when you spend your time working on your own houses, on your own lives, on your own things that you desire. How was life then? Now that we've been through this stage, this call to obedience, this looking towards the promise, this establishment of a relationship, and this call to personal holiness. Now that these messages have been delivered and been accepted of the people, and the people are living them out from this day, consider how things will change. Consider what will happen from this day forward. And those are these 4 messages delivered, one each month, leading up to the vision of Ezekiel. And so the introduction here to Ezekiel is actually one part of a 4-part installment of God's calling his people from where they were when they had pushed God's work away, where they were no longer seeking after that, but seeking themselves, and calling God's people to have a revival and reformation. He's delivered a message of obedience, of promise, of relationship, and of holiness. And once that has been established, then he comes along and he delivers these long prophecies, these visions and these prophecies that take up almost the entire of the book of Zechariah. That's the focus of this book. But before God's people could be delivered these messages, these visions, and these prophecies, they needed to have this revival. And it's the same for us. You know, when I was looking and researching into this, you know, I was seeing what other sermons were out there, and whenever I looked at sermons on Zechariah, it always came up about, you know, the Joshua the high priest, was the rubber bull and the olive trees, or the flying scrolls, the prophecy to the nations, the Christ descending on the mount, all these things about the visions and the prophecies, all these things that perk our senses, that we have this desire to know, and these things that draw us in, that we want to learn about. But all of that was only given after God's people had been through this revival. God only gave it to them after they had accepted the call to obedience, the looking towards the promise, the establishment of relationship, and the call to personal holiness. That's what they needed to go through first before God delivered to them these prophecies. And it's the same thing for us. We need to go through this personal transformation before these other prophecies and these other things that God wants us to know will actually have meaning for us and will be relevant for us. Otherwise, we're just filling our head with empty knowledge. And so that is what God wants for us. And while I was reflecting on this as well, for me personally, I also sort of felt a connection as an Advent people, because in the story of Zechariah here leading up to this, God brought his people, you know, out of Babylon with a purpose. And at first they dove headfirst into that. They dedicated everything they had into the work, into the building the temple, into establishing, you know, the law, worshiping as Moses has said, and after the ordinance of David. They threw everything they had into that. But then things got hard. They were surrounded by people that were opposing them and trying to stop them. And they gradually left off the work. Well, it came to an end when the king gave his decree, and they just left the work altogether and went about their own lives, their own ways. And I feel that as a people, we've been through that same experience. We, read stories of the pioneers when God called his people out of Babylon with, that second angel's message, Babylon is fallen, come out of Babylon. And there was this revival and this movement of God's people that were serving him, that were dedicating everything to the work. But over time, it's gotten hard, and a lot of people, myself included, have sort of put things off that we shouldn't have sort of focused on other things that we've given priority to. And in this, I find it's a call not for me personally, and also for God's people as a whole, to get back to the mission that God has called us to do. It's a call for all of us to obedience, to follow God, to look to his promise, to seek an establishment of relationship with God, and a call to personal holiness. And once we have established that, once we've been through that journey with God, God has all the stuff he wants to show us and unfolding these visions and these prophecies. But we need to have that first. We need to have that revival of primitive godliness. And then God has got so many riches of heaven and treasures of his word that he wants to unfold and bless us with.